The town of Larkspur Bend had never been kind to secrets, and yet somehow, for 6 long years, it had kept one of the biggest ones without ever quite realizing it was doing so. Clara Doyle had arrived there as a young widow with a baby on her hip and a story that fit neatly enough into the shape of every other hard-luck tale the frontier had ever produced. Husband lost, land gone, a woman forced to start over in a town where she knew not a single soul. Nobody in Larkspur Bend had reason to question it, and Clara had never given them cause to. She kept her head down, took in sewing and laundry to make ends meet, raised her daughter Maggie with a fierce and quiet devotion, and built herself a small, steady life out of the wreckage of a past she rarely spoke of, not even to herself if she could help it. But secrets have a way of waiting patiently in the dark corners of a person's life, content to sleep for years at a time, until the day some ordinary errand drags them blinking back out into the light. For Clara, that day arrived on a scorching afternoon in July, when 6-year-old Maggie came running in from playing near the creek, clutching her arm and crying in a way that made Clara's blood run cold before she even saw the wound. A gash, deep and angry, ran along the girl's forearm where a jagged rock had caught her during a fall, and though Clara pressed her apron hard against it and murmured every soothing word she knew, the bleeding would not slow, and the fear in her chest climbed higher with every passing second. There was only one place in Larkspur Bend equipped to handle a wound like that, and only one person who could stop it. The town doctor, whose office sat at the far end of Main Street behind a hand-painted sign that read, simply, Town Doctor. Clara had heard the talk, of course. The whole town had been abuzz for the better part of 2 months about the new doctor who had ridden into Larkspur Bend from somewhere out east. A serious, capable man who had, in a remarkably short time, earned the trust of nearly every family in the county. She had heard his name mentioned in the mercantile, at church, over backyard fences. Dr. Nathaniel Graves, they called him, though most simply called him Document. She had never once had cause to seek his services herself, being a woman who preferred to nurse her own small hurts and Maggie's minor scrapes with home remedies rather than spend money she didn't have. But there was no home remedy for a wound bleeding through an apron in steady, frightening pulses, and so, with her daughter cradled against her chest and her heart hammering with a fear that had nothing at all to do with the injury, Clara ran the 6 blocks to Main Street as fast as her skirts would allow. She burst through the office door without knocking, breathless, already speaking before she'd even fully crossed the threshold. "Please, my daughter's hurt bad. She's bleeding and I can't get it to." The words died in her throat. The man standing behind the doctor's desk, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reaching for a roll of clean bandage, went utterly still. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed, and the entire world seemed to fold itself down into the small, charged space between the door and the desk. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as she looked into a face she had spent 6 years trying, and failing, to forget. The same sharp jaw, the same steady gray eyes, the same broad shoulders that had once, a lifetime ago, felt like the safest place in the world. Nathaniel. Not a memory, not a ghost conjured by exhaustion and fear, but flesh and blood, standing not 10 feet away from her, staring back at her with an expression that mirrored her own shock so precisely it was almost unbearable to witness. It was Maggie's whimper of pain that broke the spell, and both adults moved at once, professional instinct and parental terror overriding whatever storm of emotion had frozen them in place. Nathaniel came around the desk quickly, his hands finding a practiced steadiness even as his eyes kept flicking, again and again, to Clara's face as though he couldn't quite trust what he was seeing. He guided Clara to the examination table, helped settle Maggie onto it, and began working on the wound with the calm, efficient hands of a man who had clearly done this 1,000 times before, even as his jaw remained tight, his breathing controlled in the way of someone forcing himself to focus through sheer will alone. "It's deep, but it missed anything serious," he said, his voice rougher than Clara remembered, though whether that was 6 years of change or the strain of the moment, she couldn't have said. "I need to clean it and stitch it. She'll be sore for a few days, but she'll heal up just fine." He glanced at Maggie then, offering her a small, gentle smile that seemed to cost him considerable effort to produce. "You're being very brave, young lady. What's your name?" "Maggie," the girl said through tears, her voice small. "Maggie Doyle." Something crossed Nathaniel's face at the sound of the name. Not recognition, not yet, but the faint flicker of a man doing arithmetic he didn't yet realize he was doing. He worked in silence after that, cleaning and stitching the wound with careful, gentle movements, murmuring reassurances to Maggie between stitches, while Clara stood at the edge of the room with her arms wrapped around herself, feeling as though she might come apart at the seams entirely. It wasn't until he had finished bandaging the arm and Maggie had been settled, drowsy from the ordeal, into a chair with a peppermint stick he'd produced from a jar on his desk, that Nathaniel finally straightened, turned to Clara, and asked the question that had clearly been building behind his eyes the entire time. "How old is she?" Clara's mouth went dry. She could have lied. She had built an entire life, 6 years deep, on the foundation of a lie far simpler than the one this question threatened to unravel. But looking into Nathaniel Graves' face, the same face she had once loved so completely, the same face that had vanished from her life without explanation on a night that had broken something in her she had never fully repaired, she found she no longer had the strength for it. "She turned 6 in April," Clara said quietly. She watched the number land on him, watched him count backward the way she had counted forward on so many long, lonely nights, watched the blood drain slowly from his face as the arithmetic completed itself and the answer arrived, undeniable and enormous. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice after 6 years of silence nearly buckled her knees. "Clara, is she?" He couldn't finish the question. He didn't need to. "Yes," Clara said, and the single word carried the weight of 6 years of secrets, 6 years of sleepless nights, 6 years of a truth she had never planned to speak aloud to the one person it belonged to most. "She's yours, Nathaniel." The office fell into a silence so complete that Clara could hear the ticking of a clock on the far wall, the distant sound of wagon wheels on Main Street, the soft, even breathing of the sleeping child neither of them had planned for and both of them, it turned out, had lost. Nathaniel sank slowly into the chair behind his desk, his hands pressed flat against its surface as though he needed something solid to hold on to. "I didn't know," he said, his voice hollow. "God, Clara, I didn't know. If I had known." "You left," Clara said, and though she had promised herself years ago that she would never say these words to him, not ever, not even if fate somehow delivered him back into her path, they came pouring out now with a force she couldn't contain. "You left without a word. One day you were talking about our future, about the house we'd build, and the next you were simply gone, and nobody in town could tell me where, and I waited for a letter that never came. I waited for months. Nathaniel. I was carrying your child and I didn't even know it yet, and you had already vanished like I'd never mattered to you at all." Nathaniel flinched as though she'd struck him, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with an old grief she hadn't expected to hear. "My father was dying," he said. "Word came in the middle of the night that he'd taken a bad turn, and I rode out before dawn without waking anyone, thinking I'd be back within the fortnight. I meant to send word the moment I arrived. I swear it. But the fever that was killing him took me too, not long after I got there. I was sick for weeks, Clara, out of my head with it, and by the time I recovered enough to write, enough time had passed that I convinced myself you'd have moved on, that a letter from a man who vanished without explanation would only hurt you worse than the silence already had. I told myself I was protecting you by staying away. I told myself 100 things to justify not coming back, and every single one of them was a lie I made up because I was too ashamed of how badly I'd handled it to face you honestly. You could have written, Clara said, her voice breaking now, 6 years of carefully guarded composure finally cracking under the weight of the conversation she'd never let herself imagine having. You could have sent word through anyone. Instead I raised our daughter alone, told this whole town I was a widow because a lie was easier to live with than the truth of a man who simply left. I know, Nathaniel said. I know, and there's no excuse I can offer that will undo what that cost you, what it cost her. I only ask that you believe I never knew about Maggie. If I had known, nothing on this earth would have kept me from coming back for you both. Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the deception she half expected to find there, the easy lie of a man caught out and scrambling to save himself. But she found none of that. She found only the raw, unguarded grief of a man confronting, all at once, the family he hadn't known he'd lost, and something in her chest, some tightly wound not she'd been carrying since the night he disappeared, loosened, just slightly, for the first time in 6 years. The days that followed were among the strangest and most delicate of Clara's life. Larkspur Bend, being a town that thrived on gossip in equal measure to its capacity for kindness, took very little time to notice that the widow Doyle and the new town doctor seemed to have some manner of history between them, though the precise nature of it remained, for a while, a matter of considerable speculation. Nathaniel, for his part, made no attempt to hide his interest in Clara and Maggie, visiting their small home on the edge of town with a regularity that raised eyebrows and loosened tongues throughout the county. He came first as a doctor, checking on Maggie's healing arm with a diligence that went well beyond medical necessity, and then, gradually, as something else entirely. A man determined to earn back a trust he understood, with painful clarity, he had no automatic right to. He did not rush her. That, Clara would later admit to herself, was the thing that undid her defenses more than any grand romantic gesture could have. He simply showed up again and again, patient and steady, bringing small kindnesses that asked for nothing in return. A bundle of wildflowers for the kitchen table, a new pair of boots for Maggie when he noticed her old ones pinching at the toes, an offer to fix the sagging porch step that Clara had been meaning to repair for over a year but never had the coin or the time to manage alone. He spent long afternoons sitting on that same porch, once he'd fixed it, talking quietly with Maggie about everything and nothing, teaching her the names of birds that visited the yard, letting her help him sort medical supplies into little jars, watching her with an expression of such tender, wondering devotion that Clara sometimes had to look away, overwhelmed by the sight of it. Maggie, unburdened by adult complications, took to him with the effortless ease of a child who simply recognizes goodness when she sees it. And it took several weeks before Clara found the courage to explain to her daughter, in words a 6-year-old could hold on to, that the kind doctor who visited so often was, in fact, her father. Maggie had absorbed this news with the particular gravity of a child working through something enormous, and then, after a long, thoughtful pause, had simply asked whether that meant he would stay forever now, a question that Clara found she could not answer with the certainty her daughter deserved, because the truth was that she herself did not yet know. There were harder conversations too. Conversations that took place after Maggie was asleep, on the porch in the cooling evening air, where Clara finally allowed herself to ask Nathaniel the question she had swallowed for 6 years. Why he had never simply come to find her once he'd recovered, why pride had won out over the courage it would have taken to face what he'd done, why a man who claimed to have loved her so completely had let shame keep him silent for so devastatingly long. Nathaniel answered each question honestly, without flinching, accepting the weight of her anger as something he had earned and owed her the right to express fully, and slowly, painstakingly, across weeks that felt like years, something began to rebuild itself between them. Not the same love they'd had before, which had been young and untested and, in the end, fragile enough to be lost to a single winter silence, but something new, forged in the harder, more honest fire of two people who had both survived loss and were choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to try again. It was not without its difficulties. There were nights when old resentment surfaced sharp and sudden, when Clara would catch herself studying Nathaniel across the dinner table and feel the ghost of 6 lonely years rise up in her chest, unbidden and bitter. There were moments when Nathaniel, too, seemed to withdraw into private guilt, disappearing into long silences as he reckoned with the years of his daughter's life he could never reclaim. First steps he hadn't witnessed, first words he hadn't heard, a childhood he had missed through no fault of his own and yet felt, deeply, that he should somehow have prevented. But they talked through each of these moments as they arose, refusing to let old wounds fester in silence the way they once had, and slowly, the town of Larkspur Bend watched a widow and a doctor become something the whole community, without quite realizing when it had happened, found itself rooting for. The proposal, when it came, was neither grand nor rehearsed. It happened on an ordinary evening in late autumn. The three of them sitting together on the porch Nathaniel had repaired all those months before, Maggie curled between them with her head against her mother's arm, half asleep and warm from a day spent playing in the crisp fall air. Nathaniel reached for Clara's hand, and when she looked at him, he simply said, "I don't want to be the man who disappears anymore, Clara. I want to be the man who stays. I want to marry you, if you'll have me, and I want to spend every single day for the rest of my life making up for the ones I missed. Not because I owe it to you, though I do, but because I love you, and I love that little girl, and I can't imagine a version of my future that doesn't have the two of you standing right at the center of it." Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once broken her heart through absence and had spent the better part of a year proving, through patient, unglamorous consistency, that he had become someone worth trusting again. She thought of the 6 years of nights she'd spent alone, telling a town full of strangers a lie about widowhood because the truth had felt too painful to speak, and she thought of the 6 months since, watching that same man learn to be a father with a devotion so complete it sometimes brought her to tears in the quiet moments when he didn't know she was watching. "Yes," she said simply, and Maggie, who had not been nearly as asleep as either adult had assumed, sat bolt upright and declared, with a particular delighted authority of a 6-year-old, that she would be picking the flowers for the wedding herself. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the church on Main Street, with the whole town of Larkspur Bend crowded into the pews, having long since abandoned any pretense of subtlety about their investment in the outcome. Maggie walked ahead of her mother down the aisle, scattering wildflowers with the same wide, joyful abandon she brought to everything, wearing a new white dress that Nathaniel had insisted on buying for her. Unable to resist spoiling the daughter, he was determined never again to give any reason to doubt his presence in her life. Clara wore her mother's old wedding dress, altered to fit, and when she reached the front of the church and took Nathaniel's hands in hers, she felt, for the first time in 6 long years, that the story she had been telling herself about her own life, widow, alone, making do, had finally, truly, become something else entirely. They built a life together that neither of them had dared to imagine during those long years apart, a life built not on the fragile romance of their youth, but on the harder, more durable foundation of honesty earned through difficulty, forgiveness chosen deliberately rather than assumed, and a shared commitment to never again let silence stand in for the truth. Nathaniel's practice grew, and with it, his reputation not merely as a skilled doctor but as a devoted family man, the sort of husband and father other men in Larkspur Bend found themselves quietly aspiring to become. Clara returned to sewing, though now for pleasure rather than necessity, crafting dresses for Maggie and, in time, for the 2 younger children who joined their family in the years that followed, each birth attended, this time, by a father who had sworn he would never again miss a single moment he had the power to be present for. Maggie grew up knowing the full, complicated truth of how her parents had found their way back to each other, a story that became, in time, something of a local legend in Larkspur Bend, retold at church socials and quilting circles with a particular fondness reserved for tales that end, against considerable odds, exactly the way love stories are meant to end. She would sometimes ask her mother, in later years, whether she had ever truly stopped loving her father during those 6 hard years apart, and Clara would always answer honestly, the way she had promised herself she always would from that day forward, that she had told herself she'd stopped, had built an entire careful life around the belief that she'd stopped, but that some part of her heart, stubborn and patient, had apparently never quite gotten the message, waiting all along for the day. Fate, in the unassuming form of a child's skinned knee, would walk her straight back through the door of the one man she had never truly managed to leave behind. And on quiet evenings, sitting together on that same porch Nathaniel had once repaired as a man still trying to earn his way back into a family he'd never known was his, the 2 of them would watch their children play in the fading light and understand, without needing to say it aloud, that some of the deepest kinds of love are not the ones that arrive easily, but the ones brave enough to be rebuilt, patiently and honestly, out of the wreckage of everything that once went wrong.